Hi, it's Bethany from Smart Edition Academy. In today's video, we are starting our HESI A&P review on the organization of the human body. The organization of the human body is just one of the many systems you will be expected to answer questions on in the HESI A&P section. We will go through a practice question bank all about the organization of the human body. I will read the test question and the possible answers to you and then pause and give you a few seconds to think about the correct answer. I will then explain the correct answer and share some helpful ways to remember the information we review. To keep studying for the HESI exam, check out the links below for a free HESI practice test and online study course. Let's get started. All right, our first question is, the maintenance of normal blood sugar is what type of feedback mechanism? Is it negative, neutral, positive, or proximal? The correct answer here is negative. So the body has two feedback mechanisms, negative and positive. The negative feedback mechanism regulates most body systems and maintains homeostasis by resisting or making any deviations outside of what the body experiences as normal, smaller. So homeostasis, when you see the word homeostasis, think of steady or consistent. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively consistent or quote-unquote normal environment within the body. So with negative feedback, it maintains homeostasis by resisting or making any changes or deviations outside of the normal smaller. So an example of this would be maintaining a normal or close to normal blood pressure. Now, the other feedback mechanism within the body is the positive feedback mechanism. So the positive feedback mechanism is not homeostatic and it is rare in healthy people. The positive feedback mechanism is a deviation from normal, and the response is a much greater deviation. So in some cases, this can lead so far from homeostasis that it can actually result in death. An example of this would be inadequate delivery of blood flow to the cardiac muscles. If that inadequate delivery of blood flow to the cardiac muscles continues without intervention, then eventually the cardiac muscles will cease to function appropriately and the heart can stop, which can lead to death. One way to remember the feedback mechanisms and kind of keep straight which is to think of negative as essentially normal. So in and in, and then think of positive as a positive test result. And so that would indicate a disease process or a deviation from healthy, so P&P. Childbirth is a response to hormones in a woman's body. What type of feedback mechanism is at work during childbirth? Is it neutral feedback, positive feedback, negative feedback, or do you need more information to answer this question? The correct answer here is positive feedback. So remember in the last question, we said homeostasis, think steady or consistent, is the maintenance of a relatively consistent environment within the body, such as maintaining your body temperature, blood sugar, or blood pressure. If you remember from the last question, negative feedback means that any deviation from a set point is made smaller or resisted in attempts to maintain homeostasis or normality within the body. Whereas the positive feedback system is not homeostatic and it's a deviation from normal. So childbirth is a positive feedback mechanism because it is a deviation from homeostasis. The knee is blank to the foot. Is it distal, inferior, proximal, or superior? The correct answer is proximal. I'm going to show you a graphic of a skeleton. So here's our skeleton. When we discuss directional terms referring to the body, it's always talking about the body being in anatomical position regardless of how the body is actually positioned if you were looking at a person. So the term anatomical position refers to a person that is standing upright with feet facing forward, as you can see that with our skeleton here, arms hanging at the sides, and palms facing forward. So with the skeleton, you can tell that the palms are facing forward because the thumb, which is the shorter bone here, is positioned on the outside. So proximal and distal describe the positions of a structure. Proximal is closer to the origin, and distal means that it is further away from the origin. In anatomy, when we say the origin of the body, we're referring to the trunk of the body. So the trunk of the body is going to be your torso area, chest, abdomen. So the knee, which is here, is proximal to the foot because the knee is closer to the origin or the trunk of the body, whereas your foot is distal because it's down here and it's further away from the trunk of the body. A person wakes up with a fever. The body begins its response to locate the origin of the problem and to fix it. What type of feedback mechanism is this? Is it equal, negative, neutral, or positive? So the correct answer here is negative. If you remember from just a few questions ago, the body has two feedback mechanisms. They are negative and positive. Because this question tells us that the body is beginning its response to locate the origin of the problem and to fix it, we know that the negative feedback mechanism is in play because if you recall, the negative feedback mechanism means that any deviation from a set point, so your normothermia point, is made smaller or is resisted. So the body starting to regulate the temperature is an example of a negative feedback mechanism. Which of the following cavities contains the urinary bladder, part of the intestines, and the internal reproductive organs? Is it the abdominal, dorsal, pelvic, or thoracic? The correct answer is pelvic. I'm going to show you an image of the body cavities. So body cavities are either dorsal, meaning back, or ventral, which is not listed here, but meaning towards the front. So your pelvic cavity is down here and sits below the abdominal cavity. And although in this diagram we have our abdominal and our pelvic cavity as separate cavities, you may sometimes hear it referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity, and they just kind of group that into one. But your pelvic cavity houses part of the intestines, the other part of them are in the abdominal cavity, the bladder, and the internal reproductive organs. The abdominal cavity contains organs such as your stomach, the rest of the intestines, the kidneys, the liver, the pancreas, and the spleen. And then the thoracic cavity is going to contain the heart and the lungs. Which of the following types of tissues includes cells in the cells of the immune system and of the blood? Is it connective, epithelial, muscle, or neural? The correct answer here is connective. So connective tissues are characterized by extracellular materials that separate cells from each other. So the clue in this question is which type of tissues include cells, and that would be connective. And one way to remember this is to think of C equals C, so cells equal connective, or connective tissue equals cells. Which cavity is surrounded by the rib cage and separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm? Is it the abdominal, the gastric, the pelvic, or the thoracic? The correct answer is the thoracic. Let's go back to our picture of our body cavities. So cavities are essentially spaces in the body that house and protect organs. So the ventral cavity, like we said a few questions ago, is the front of the body, contains your three major cavities, the thoracic, abdominal, the pelvic, and remember sometimes the abdominal and the pelvic are grouped together and called the abdominopelvic. One way that you can remember the ventral body cavities is to use the mnemonic TAP, T for thoracic, A for abdominal, and P for pelvic. And the thoracic cavity is surrounded by the rib cage because it is up in the chest where the rib cage is. And if you recall, the main organs that it houses are the heart and the lungs. So the rib cage is protecting those organs. And then the diaphragm, essentially here, separates the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. And if you recall from a couple questions ago, the abdominal cavity contains organs such as your stomach, part of the intestines, kidneys, liver, pancreas, and spleen. And then the pelvic cavity is below the abdominal cavity, and it contains the other part of the intestines, the urinary bladder, and the internal reproductive organs. What are the subdivisions of the dorsal cavity located in the back of the human body? Are they cranial and spinal, dorsal and ventral, lateral and proximal, or inferior and superior? The correct answer here is cranial and spinal. Let's go back to our picture of the body cavities. So dorsal essentially means towards the back. And the dorsal cavity is subdivided into the cranial cavity, so the brain, where the brain is housed, and the spinal or the vertebral cavity. You may hear spinal and vertebral used interchangeably, but essentially that just means that it's the where the spinal cord is housed, and it's protected by the vertebral bodies, which is why you may hear it kind of referred to as either spinal or vertebral cavities. What type of tissue controls when the heart beats? Is it connective, epithelial, muscle, or nervous? The correct answer is nervous. So, nervous tissues control impulses. So, nerve, impulse, they go hand in hand. And impulses tell the heart when it needs to beat. So, therefore, your nervous tissues control the heartbeat. When dissecting an organ, sometimes a blank cut needs to be made to divide the organ into top and bottom halves. Is this a coronial cut, a mid-sagittal cut, a sagittal cut, or a transverse cut? So the correct answer is transverse. Let's take a look at a picture of our different planes or cuts. So you can see here that the transverse plane is the green, and it essentially is dividing the body into a top and a bottom half, or a superior and an inferior plane. So the transverse plane runs parallel to the surface of the ground. So your ground surface is here, it's parallel to the surface of the ground, and divides the body into two planes, so top and bottom. So if you need to cut an organ into a top and a bottom half, you would use a transverse cut. or an blank is any living thing considered as a whole. Is it a cell, an organ, an organism, or a variable? The correct answer here is an organism. So an organism is any living thing considered as a whole. Organisms can have anywhere from a single cell to trillions of cells, but they're a living thing. The ventral cavity, front of the body, contains blank major cavities. Does it contain 2, 3, 5, or 9 major cavities? The correct answer here is 3. Let's go back to our picture of the cavities. So ventral, meaning towards the front, so towards the front of the body. And if you remember our mnemonic TAP, thoracic, abdominal, pelvic. So the ventral cavity is divided into, or contains 3 cavities. So if you remember, the thoracic cavity is on the top, contains heart and lungs, separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm. The organs inside the abdominal cavity are the stomach, part of the intestines, kidneys, spleen, pancreas. And then below the abdominal cavity is the pelvic cavity. Remember, sometimes you may hear these termed abdominopelvic. But inside the pelvic cavity, there is a portion of the intestines, the bladder, and your internal reproductive organs. Which plane of the body divides the body into 2 equal halves? Is this the cranial, the mid-sagittal, the sagittal, or the transverse? So the correct answer here is mid-sagittal. We'll go back to the picture of our planes. So the sagittal plane is represented here in pink. And because the question is asking us which plane divides the body into 2 equal halves, think of mid as middle. And so if you're dividing something in the middle, you're essentially dividing it into 2 equal halves because you're cutting it straight down the middle, so mid-sagittal. Body temperature can increase in a hot environment or decrease in a cold environment. Body temperature can be considered a blank. Is it a cell, a chemical, a factor, or a variable? The correct answer here is a variable. So if you remember, homeostasis is the existence and maintenance of a relatively consistent environment within the body. Each cell of the body is surrounded by a small amount of fluid, and normal functions of each cell depends on the maintenance of that environment within a narrow range of conditions. And this can include temperature, volume, or chemical content. These conditions, temperature, volume, or chemical content, are known as variables. So a variable is something that can fluctuate, and because the body temperature can increase in a hot environment and decrease in a cold environment, it fluctuates, and so body temperature is considered a variable. Which anatomical position promotes access to the stomach? Is it medial, prone, superficial, or supine? So our correct answer is supine. So when we talk about supine position, we're basically referring to someone who is laying on their back. And when you're laying on your back, your torso is accessible. So torso, abdomen are accessible. So supine, back, access to the stomach, think S and S, supine stomach. Medial is basically meaning towards the middle or towards the midline of the body. And then prone, if someone is in a prone position, that means they are laying face down. And in a prone position, you would be able to access the spine, the back of the skull, back of the body. And then superficial basically means as it sounds, superficial, or just, the top layer. Which of the following types of tissue resemble long threads? Is it connective, epithelial, muscle, or neural? The correct answer here is muscle. So cells of muscles resemble long threads, and they are called fibers. So if you think of a muscle as just a really strong woven substance, to weave something, you have to have threads, and threads are fibers. So that's kind of a way that can just help you remember that muscle tissue resembles threads, because muscle tissue is made up of fibers, and fibers can be a type of textile, and thread, fiber kind of goes hand in hand. Which of the following organs is located in the pelvic cavity? Is it the heart, intestines, liver, or pancreas? The correct answer here is intestines. Remember, part of the intestines are located within your pelvic cavity. The heart is located in the thoracic cavity, and the liver and the pancreas are in the abdominal cavity. The breastbone or sternum is blank to the chest. Is it distal, lateral, medial, or proximal? The correct answer here is medial. Let's go back and look at our skeleton. So if you recall from a few questions ago that directional terms refer to the body in the anatomical position, which means that the body is standing upright, the feet are facing forward, the arms are hanging at the sides, and the palms are facing forward. The sternum, which is this bone right here, it's in the middle of the rib cages on either side of the sternum. So the sternum is in the middle of the chest or midline of the body. Medial means towards the middle or midline, so the sternum is medial to the chest. One way to kind of remember this is to remember M equals M, or medial equals middle or midline. In blank feedback, a deviation from a normal value causes the system to make the deviation even greater. Is this equal feedback, negative feedback, neutral feedback, or positive feedback? The correct answer here is positive feedback. Remember that the body has two feedback mechanisms, negative and positive, and that positive feedback is not homeostatic, and it's a deviation from normal. So right here in this question, you're getting that clue, deviation from normal, causing the system to make the deviation even greater. That's positive feedback, because negative feedback would be making the deviation not have an effect or having a very small effect. And if you remember, positive feedback creates a cycle leading away from homeostasis, and remember, it's rarely something that is seen in someone who is healthy, and in some cases it can result in death. In that example that we used earlier, inadequate delivery of blood to the cardiac muscle, if there isn't an intervention performed or that's not gotten under control, then the cardiac muscle can cease to function properly, the heart can stop, and that can result in death. The skin and linings of internal organs are examples of what type of tissue? Is it connective, epithelial, muscle, or neural? The correct answer here is epithelial. Oftentimes, when you think of epithelial tissue, your mind may go straight to the skin. But epithelial tissue also protects underlying structures. It acts as a barrier, and it permits the passage of substances and also secretes substances. Which of the following levels of body organization involves the interaction between atoms and molecules? Is it cell, chemical, organ, or tissue? The correct answer here is chemical. The chemical level involves interactions between atoms and their combination into molecules. Which of the following regions of the body is divided into the thigh, leg, ankle, and foot? Is it central, the head, lower, or upper? The correct answer here is lower. Think lower equals leg, and the thigh, ankle, and foot are all part of the leg, and so therefore they're found in the lower region of the body. The central region of the body would be more like your torso. Upper region, think kind of shoulders, arms, and then of course the head. What type of tissue coordinates and controls many body activities? Is this connective, epithelial, muscle, or neural? The correct answer here is neural. So cells are composed of dendrites, cell bodies, and axons. The neural body system, neural nervous system, coordinates and controls many of these body activities. Blank are composed of two or more tissue types that together perform one or more common functions. Is this cells, chemicals, organs, or tissues? The correct answer here is organs. An organ is composed of two or more tissue types that together perform one or more common function. So for example, the heart is mainly composed of cardiomyocytes and connective tissue. And those tissue types work together to make the heart contract and pump blood. Blank is a point in the functioning of a human body where everything is working optimally. Is this diffusion, homeostasis, metabolism, or variable? The correct answer here is homeostasis. If you think back a few questions, remember that we said when you see the term homeostasis, think of steady or consistent. And homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively consistent environment within the body. So relatively consistent would mean that everything is working optimally, working like it needs to work to keep everything within that relatively consistent or that homeostatic state. So examples of this would be thermoregulation, or regulating your temperature, maintaining blood sugar, or maintaining blood pressure. Which of the following is a function of epithelial tissue? Is it secreting toxins, expelling mucus, acting as barriers, or secreting hormones? So the correct answer here is acting as barriers. So remember, when you think of epithelial tissue, you think of the skin, and the skin acts as a barrier that prevents things like foreign bodies and whatnot from entering into the internal portion of the body. So epithelial tissue is a barrier or that protective layer. Which best describes homeostasis? Is it a functional system of the body, blood flow to every cell in the body, a relatively consistent environment within the body, or neural pathways that have integrated into the body? So remember, homeostasis, think steady or consistent. So homeostasis is a relatively consistent environment within the body. And again, examples of this would be thermoregulation, regulating your body temperature, maintaining blood sugar, or maintaining blood pressure. The wrist is blank to the shoulder. Is this distal, lateral, median, or superior? The correct answer here is distal. Let's go back and look at our skeleton. So here's your wrist right here. The carpal bones make up the wrist. So if you remember, directional terms refer to the body in the anatomical position. The anatomical position is when the body is standing upright, feet are facing forward, arms are hanging to the side, and the palms of the hand are facing forward. Remember, when we're looking at a skeleton, we can tell that they're in an anatomical position and that their palms are facing forward because the thumb is on the outside of the hand. So proximal and distal describe the position of a structure. Proximal is closer to the origin and distal is further away. If you remember in anatomy, the origin refers to the trunk of the body. So here, trunk is chest, abdomen area. So your shoulder, which is up here, is proximal because it's closer to the trunk of the body. And the wrist here is distal because it's further away from the trunk. So the wrist is distal to the shoulder. What anatomical term means away from the surface? Is it anterior, deep, proximal, or ventral? So the correct answer here is deep. Think of away from the surface as being far from your abdomen, like the surface of your abdomen, so deep in your abdominal cavity. So basically, away from the surface, deep, goes hand in hand. The term anatomical position refers to a person standing erect or upright with the feet facing forward, the arms hanging to the sides, and blank. Is it eyes looking down, eyes looking forward, palms facing forward, or palms facing toward the body? The correct answer here is palms facing forward. So remember, when we're talking about directional terms, when we are referring to the body, we are referring to the body in the anatomical position. Which term is synonymous with posterior? Is it dorsal, inferior, proximal, or superior? The correct answer here is dorsal. So remember, when we refer to directional terms, when we're referring to anatomy, the body is in that anatomical position. Both dorsal and posterior mean towards the back. The lips are blank to the neck. Is it anterior, deep, inferior, or superior? The correct answer here is superior. So let's go back to our skeleton, even though we're looking at the skeleton, so we're not seeing any lips. Superior refers to a structure above another structure. So because the lips are above the neck, so lips and mouth above the neck, the lips are superior. Another way that you could look at this is you could say that your orbital sockets, or where your eyes would go, is superior to your mandible or your jawbone because it's above. In the same sense, you can say that the shoulder is superior to the wrist because it is above the wrist. The hip is blank to the thigh. Is it anterior superior, deep, proximal, or superficial? So the correct answer here is anterior superior. So we'll go back and we'll look at our skeleton. The hip here, this is your hip socket, and the thigh is basically here where your femur is. So anterior superior means in the front, anterior, and superior meaning above. So your hip is both anterior and superior to the thigh. The shoulder is blank to the fingertips. Is it distal, inferior, proximal, or superficial? So the correct answer here is proximal. Let's go back and look at our skeleton again. Your shoulder is up here and fingers here, phalanges. Remember that proximal means closer to the trunk of the body. So your shoulder is proximal because your shoulder's here to your fingers. So another way to kind of think about it is that your shoulder is closer to the point of attachment to the body, because the shoulder is literally where, the arm attaches to the body here in the socket here. So that's another way to think of it. The shoulder is proximal because it is closer to the point of attachment to the body compared to another structure, whereas your fingers are all the way down here. So I hope this review has been helpful. The HESI A2 A&P exam section includes not only questions on the organization of the human body, but also the cardiovascular, muscular, skeletal, nervous, endocrine system, and more. In the links below, you'll find a free HESI A&P practice test and a HESI online study course, which includes study lessons, videos, flashcards, and more on all sections of the HESI A2, including math, A&P, chemistry, biology, reading, physics, grammar, and vocabulary. Thanks for joining us for this practice test, and good luck with your studying.